Good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission on the human rights situation in Mexico. I extend a special thanks to our witnesses today, two of whom are joining us from Mexico. This commission last held a hearing on human rights in Mexico in May 2012. At that time, 50,000 people were estimated to have been killed in drug-related violence in Mexico. Security forces were accused of torture and involvement in extrajudicial killings and forced disappearances. Abuses were being fueled by corruption, links between law enforcement personnel and criminal groups, a weak justice system, and widespread impunity. Migrants, human rights defenders, and journalists were often the victims. In fact, just a few days before that hearing, authorities had found the dismembered bodies of three photojournalists in a canal in the city of Boca del Rio. 10 years later, it is hard to argue that the situation has improved. Just 3 days ago, in the state of Chihuahua, three men were shot to death inside a church. Two Jesuit priests, Javier Campos Morales and Joaquin Cesar Mora Salazar, and a third man, Pedro Palma, a tourist guide. The priest had been trying to protect the guide from the man who is now accused of murdering them, a local crime boss the priest knew and who had an outstanding arrest order for the 2018 killing of a U.S. tourist. All of us surely condemn these horrific murders. I was immediately reminded of the brutal assassination of six Jesuit priests, their housekeeper, and her daughter in El Salvador in 1989 at the height of that country's civil war. It is heartbreaking and enraging that the Mexican priests, who similarly had dedicated their lives to ministry to the poor, met the same fate. Nationwide, 34 priests have been murdered in Mexico since 2012, including Father Campos and Father Moro. At least 7 of the killings have occurred since President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador took office. The slayings reinforced Mexico's reputation as one of the world's most murderous countries for Catholic clergy. But it is important to understand that the murders of Father Campos and Father Mora were not an isolated event. The rural region where they ministered is overrun with organized crime. Some 30 indigenous leaders have been killed there in the past 2 decades, and hundreds of people have been displaced as criminal organizations have expanded. Yesterday, I met with several human rights defenders who just received the 2022 Frontline Defenders Award for Human Rights Defenders at Risk. Among them were Javier and Maria del Transito, professors from Guanajuato. Their daughter, Guadalupe, also a teacher, disappeared in February 2020. A year later, her remains were found in a clandestine grave along with 80 other bodies. After she was found, her brother Javier joined the state-level search commission to continue looking for other missing persons and support their families. As a result of his human rights work, Javier was killed on May 29, 2021, by individuals linked to the disappearance of his sister. The parents were forced to flee Guanajuato to protect themselves. Guadalupe's disappearance is also not an isolated case. Many of us followed the grisly case of the 43 students who disappeared in September 2014 from a rural teachers' college. 7.5 years later, evidence of state complicity has grown while truth and justice for the victims remains elusive. Last month, Mexico reached a grim milestone. 100,000 people officially registered as disappeared. That is a stunning number. In a report issued in April, the UN Committee on Enforced Disappearances concluded that a generalized situation of disappearances persists in a large part of Mexico's territory, accompanied by near total impunity and re-victimization. This is why several members of Congress, myself included, recently wrote to the Biden administration to ask what the U.S. is doing through its bilateral cooperation to address this tragic situation. Several of us also wrote to the administration to ask what is being done in response to the killing of journalists. 145 journalists have been killed in Mexico since 2000, 11 of them in 2022 alone. Mexico consistently ranks among the countries with the most unsolved journalist murders per capita. Those who investigate corruption and organized crime, especially if the cases involve public officials, are at particular risk. These statistics are comparable or worse than those of countries actively at war. To give just one data point, in Colombia, between 1992 and 2022, a time period that covers the worst years of the internal armed conflict, 93 journalists and media workers were killed. That is an appalling number. Yet the absolute number of killings in Mexico is even worse. In recent years, the U.S. has taken steps to help Mexico improve human rights conditions. We will continue, we will include a brief summary of the U.S. response in the record of this hearing. At the insistence of Congress, vetting requirements are in effect for security forces, for security force units receiving U.S. training and equipment. Excuse me. There is support for human rights and rule of law programming, and conditions and reporting requirements have been placed on foreign assistance funds. One initiative is investing $2.5 million to respond to forced disappearances in Chihuahua, the state where the priests were just killed. Yet the panorama remains bleak. This hearing then is an opportunity to hear from human rights organizations that monitor Mexico and work on the ground there. And our question to them is what has worked, even if on the margins, to improve the protection of human rights in Mexico? What simply is not working, and what more is there that we can do? They are witnesses to the gut-wrenching violence that is consuming Mexico. We will be well served by their analysis and their recommendations. I'm now happy to turn to the Human Rights, the co-chair of the Human Rights Commission, my friend Chris Smith, for any opening remarks he may have.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair McGovern, for your opening remarks and for today's timely hearing on human rights challenges in Mexico, which follows the disappointing 9th Summit of the Americas just some 2 weeks ago in LA. Roughly 1/3 of the heads of state from Latin America and the Caribbean, including Mexico, failed to attend the summit, which reflects poorly on the leadership of the U.S. and in the Western Hemisphere. What preceded the summit also, I think, was very disturbing and relates to the topic of this hearing. Human rights challenges in Mexico, which have been exacerbated under the rule of President Lopez Obrador, commonly known as AMLO, given his strongman tendencies. It has been reported that before the summit, which he eventually decided to boycott, AMLO lobbied the Biden administration for invitations on behalf of some of the hemisphere's most ruthless abusers of human rights, Maduro of Venezuela, Ortega of Nicaragua, and Diaz-Canel of Cuba. Tellingly, AMLO's absence contrasts with his participation in and promotion of the CELAC-China Forum last December, which Mexico hosted. Among other things, Foreign Secretary Marcelo Ebrard discussed greater collaboration with Wang Yi, the Foreign Minister of the People's Republic of China, issuing a joint action plan for cooperation in key areas between China and CELAC, the community of Latin American and Caribbean states. I note that CELAC is emerging as a shadow alternative to the Organization of American States and excludes the United States. It is also important that we recognize that AMLO is a man of the left, and the human rights situation in Mexico needs to be understood in a particularly historical context and in a broader regional context where we are witnessing the rise of new leftism in the Western Hemisphere. In Mexico's case, corruption and disregard for human rights is rooted in the history of this past century, beginning in the 1920s when President Calles, another strongman of the left, implemented rigorous restrictions on the Catholic Church, which outlawed Catholic-led education below the secondary level and nationalized property that was used for religious worship. Under freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and other core fundamental freedoms were undermined under Calles and the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI, which embedded itself into governmental, educational, and social institutions at all levels, fostering a culture of corruption as it ruled Mexico for over 70 years. PRI, incidentally, is where AMLO got his start, though he has migrated to political parties further to the left, including the now Morena, which he founded and from which he was elected president. When AMLO was inaugurated on December 1st, 2018, for a single 6-year term, he promised, quote, change in the political regime, and one that is, quote, profound and radical, but at the same time, one in which, quote, corruption and impunity that has impeded the rebirth of Mexico will end. So far, halfway through his tenure as president, AMLO has followed through on his threat of profound and radical change, but failed to keep his promise on fighting corruption and impunity. While Mexico's president hurls insults at the press, it is one of the deadliest times, as you know as well, Mr. Chairman, for the press in Mexican history, as physical attacks on journalists increased 85% since the president took office, amounting to 1,924 attacks, including 33 murders between 2019 and 2021, according to Reporters Without Borders. President Lopez Obrador has attacked the National Electoral Institute and recommended citizens elect electoral authorities instead, which many worry could easily be corrupted. He has also sought to abolish the National Institute for Access to Information, allegedly to cover up his family's personal use of taxpayer money. President Lopez Obrador has refused to counter the influence of local and transnational criminal groups, as well as drug cartels in Mexico's political branches, especially in the judicial branch. According to the Mexican think tank Mexico Evalúa, impunity for federal crimes reached new highs in 2020, while the institutions responsible for investigating these crimes had funding slashed when AMLO took office. This is not without precedent in the Western Hemisphere. After Hugo Chavez took office in Venezuela in 1998, he immediately began to undermine the other branches of government and erode checks and balances. For example, he attacked judges who disagreed with him and expanded the Supreme Court from 20 to 32 magistrates, while taking other actions not recognized in the 1961 Bolivarian Constitution. Venezuela today has transitioned from the richest country in Latin America to one of extreme poverty. In Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega has won sham elections, persecuted political opponents, and extended term limits by altering the Constitution. All of this follows the model of Cuba, where repression that was so much a part of the Castro brothers' rule continues under Miguel Diaz-Canel. We will wait to see what happens in Colombia, where former left-wing guerrilla Gustavo Petro has just been elected, following coordinated agitation that was cataloged at a hearing last year on Colombia by one of our witnesses today, Jose Cardenas. So today's hearing is important. Popular revulsion at PRI's corruption led to a political earthquake in the year 2000 when Vicente Fox was elected president from the National Action Party, breaking PRA's stranglehold on power at the national level. Competitive elections were held since then, and hopefully enough institutional checks will remain once AMLO has left office. Finally, I want to note the presence here today of a representative from the Miguel Augustin Pro Center for Human Rights. Our original witness could not be here today because just this week, two Jesuit priests and a tour guide were slain in northern Mexico in Chihuahua State while inside a local church at the hands of armed gunmen, and he is addressing that now. We should remember Blessed Miguel Pro, who stood against the injustice of the Calles regime nearly a century ago, holding out his arms in the form of a cross while shouting, "Long live Christ the King," at the moment of his execution. Bravery like that is what is necessary to confront evil, be it human rights abuses and corruption committed by government officials, or murder by organized criminals who act often with impunity because of the corruption of government officials. I thank you again. Thank our witnesses for taking the time to write and prepare their testimonies, which will be very helpful to our commission. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, thank you. Again, thank all the witnesses for being here. Let me just introduce our witnesses. Maria Luisa Aguilar Rodriguez is the coordinator for international advocacy at the Miguel Augustin Pro Juarez Human Rights Center, also known as Centro PROD. She designs and implements national and international advocacy strategies to respond to serious human rights violations, mainly cases of enforced disappearances, sexual torture, and women's and indigenous peoples' rights. She previously worked in a local human rights organization in Guerrero. She holds an MA in Human Rights Theory and Practice from the University of Essex in England. Paula Maria Saucedo Ruiz is Protection and Defense Officer for Mexico and Central America at Article 19. She leads protection strategies for journalists in the country, as well as security training for journalists and human rights defenders. She also coordinates the advocacy strategies to promote freedom of expression and protection for journalists and on the right to protest. Paula is a gender specialist and worked previously with several NGOs, the UN, and international cooperation agencies. She holds an MA in International Development and Gender from the University of Melbourne. Tyler Mathiacci is an American researcher at Human Rights Watch covering Mexico and Guatemala. His recent work is focused on immigration and access to asylum, press freedom and violence against journalists, abuses by police and the military, and prison conditions, among other issues. He's lived and worked in many parts of Latin America and the Caribbean. He holds a master's degree from the London School of Economics. Stephanie Brewer is the director for Mexico and migrant rights at WOLA. She advocates for policy improvements on both sides of the border to protect human rights and support the rule of law in Mexico, with a focus on public security, criminal justice, protection of migrant rights, and the prevention and punishment of torture, enforced disappearances, and other serious human rights violations. She monitors the impact of U.S. policy toward Mexico in these areas and advocates for placing human rights at the center of the U.S.-Mexico relationship and prioritizing the well-being of the population. Jose R. Cardenas is a principal with the Cormac Group and has served in senior positions in the U.S. Department of State, National Security Council, USAID, OAS, and is a senior professional staff member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He is an advisor to the Foundation for Human Rights in Cuba, a member of the Research Council of the Center for a Free Cuba, and a course coordinator at the U.S. State Department's Foreign Service Institute. I welcome all of you, and we will begin with Maria Luisa Aguilar Rodriguez.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. My name is Maria Luisa Aguilar. I'm the Advocacy Coordinator at the Human Rights Center Miguel Agustín Pro Juárez, Center WO. I'm actually, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm grateful for the opportunity to address the Commission, and we appreciate your understanding for the last-minute changes. As you mentioned, my colleague Santiago Aguirre was initially going to be here, but he's now in Chihuahua, focused on responding to the shocking assassination of the two Jesuit priests. 10 years ago, in May 2012, this commission held another hearing about human rights situation. On that occasion, our colleagues insisted that impunity was widespread and was a standing invitation for violence to continue permitting our country. 10 years on, many things have changed in Mexico, but not the human rights crisis nor the widespread impunity. We have now an official record of 100,000 disappeared persons and more than 50,000 unidentified human bodies. Homicides and executions are not decreasing. The killing of the two Jesuits is very close to Centro Pro for being a Jesuit-funded organization. The events were shocking, but not uncommon. A member of the organized crime operating under the protection of the Mexican authorities opened fire on them when the priests were opening the doors of the temple for a person that was seeking refuge. Their bodies were only recovered and identified today. In addition, at least 2 people were disappeared on the same day in related events, and we don't know their whereabouts. Father Javier and Father Joaquin were 2 good men who for decades served the poorest or the poorer in one of the most neglected indigenous regions of the country. Events like this happen all the time in Mexico. We continue to record more than 35,000 homicides per year. This is undisputable, influenced by the demand for drugs from the United States and the trafficking of assault weapons across our border. But let me be clear, the primary responsibility for preserving the lives and rights of population lies with the Mexican authorities. They, including the current federal administration that came to power with the promise of change, have failed us. From our perspective, the 2 main factors that explain the persistencies of the violence and insecurity crisis in Mexico are the failed militarized security policy and the absence of effective and truly autonomous prosecutor's office. I will elaborate on both issues. First is the militarized security policy. For more than 15 years, administrations had relied on the use of the Army and the Navy as the answer to widespread violence. However, violence has not diminished, and the armed forces frequently commit human rights violations without being held fully accountable to civilian authorities. The current federal administration, without first reviewing or promoting investigations to hold the armed forces in the past cases of abuses and corruption responsible, created a new nationwide militarized police force called the National Guard. Moreover, the military participation in public life has expanded by giving them responsibilities in many aspects of the public administration. Faced with this reality, it's important to remember that it's a false prerogative that in Mexico we face a war between good and evil. In states like Chihuahua, where the two priests were murdered, the lines between the government and the criminals are frequently blurry. This also applies to the armed forces. It is mistaken to claim that these are incorruptible or unimpeachable forces. On the contrary, its opacity and false objection to the criminal controls makes them prone to abuse. Therefore, we are extremely concerned for the government's claim to seek a constitutional reform to fully and irreversibly hand over the National Guard to the armed forces, finally giving up on having a civilian police with a nation scope, reliable and democratic. Secondly, I would like to refer to the absence of efficient and truly autonomous prosecutor's office. A few years ago, a broad civil society coalition launched several initiatives to fundamentally reform these key aspects of our broken justice system. Reforms were adopted and changes to practices were announced. However, today we have to accept that in most of the country, we only adopted the modification of institutional names, nothing more. The capacity to scientifically investigate crimes and unravel criminal networks remain as lacking and deficient as ever. The disappointment at the lack of changes is all the greater because of the lack of responsibilities of the federal attorney general's offices. Instead of having an attorney general who makes groundbreaking proposals to face the challenges of the present and prepare the justice system for the challenges of the future, we have one who seeks to return to the authoritarian past, even promoting counter reforms that could undermine changes or improvements that took decades to achieve. That is why in Mexico, we still have 95% of the homicides which are not solved. I will primarily emphasize that Mexico's impunity problem is situated with the prosecutors and not the judges. The main issues are corruption, collusion, and the lack of capacities of investigation of crimes. Finally, I would like to insist that to address the human rights crisis in Mexico, the government of civil society is fundamental. The strengthening of civil society is fundamental. State institutions must be strengthened, but there will only be progress if victims' collectives, civil society organizations, and independent journalists are also strengthened. This is how we achieve normative and practice changes before. More than ever, it is fundamental to recognize that this, because in our country, as in many parts of the world, aggressive rhetoric is used against the work of civil society. To conclude, like Father Javier and Joaquin, whose murders today, I ask you especially to demand for justice. Thousands of Mexicans are living the consequences of the ongoing violence. This crisis of violence must be understood as a human rights crisis, and the solutions therefore should involve the collaboration with the international community and especially with the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ms. Sayucedo?
Thank you. Well, good evening, Co-Chair McGovern, Co-Chair Smith, Commission members, colleagues from NGOs, and everyone who is listening. Thank you all for being here, for the invitation, and for the opportunity to share information about Mexico. My name is Paula Saucedo, and I am the Protection and Defense Program Officer at Article 19 Mexico. Throughout the last 3 years in Mexico, we have witnessed, as never before, the consolidation of a worrying tendency to deny and erase problems related to human rights from public discourse. The denial of reality has both immediate and longer-term consequences for the exercise of these rights, particularly that of freedom of expression, because it requires downplaying issues and excising a range of topics from public conversation. This denial and selective ignorance and the absence of a state is reflected in the mechanisms of official information, disinformation, public stigmatization, discretionality in the allocation of official advertising, shortcomings in the transparency system, violence against the press, digital divide, absence of mechanisms to guarantee access to information for communities and indigenous people, restriction of internet rights, a weak and crumbling institutional framework, and the lack of truth in cases of serious human rights violations. But today, I will focus on the challenges and the fact that in Mexico, the press is under attack. Mexico, as you may all know, continues to be the most dangerous country in the Americas to practice journalism. Only in 2022, 11 journalists have been killed and 29 remain disappeared. And in Article 19, we document that every 14 hours, a journalist or media outlet is attacked in connection to their work. Including data registered last year during the current term of office of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, there have already been almost 2,000 attacks against the press. This is an 85% increase upon the first 3 years of the last president, Enrique Peña Nieto. Also, in 2021, Article 19 registered for the first time at least one attack against the press in each state of the country. Threats and attacks against journalists and media outlets come from a variety of sources, members of organized crime, private individuals and companies, but mostly state actors. Every year, on average, 2 out of every 5 attacks against the press can be directly linked to Mexican authorities. The violence against the press does not change based on the political party. And this is because in a country like Mexico, so corrupt and so impune, the press constitutes a counterbalance. That is why the coverage most closely linked to violence against journalists is corruption and politics. For instance, in 2021, out of the 644 attacks that we documented that year, almost 45% of the total were linked to that coverage, followed of the coverage of security and justice with almost 24%. I also want to highlight that in 1 year, the attacks against those covering land and territory issues have tripled from 8 attacks in 2020 to 24 in 2021. And this could have links to the government's economic strategy and mega projects. The reality that the press suffers on a daily basis is also denied by authorities. Furthermore, the state actively denies the challenges faced by the press while stigmatizing. As an example, during the weekly presidential morning conference, there is a segment called Who is Who in the Lies. So every Wednesday, the federal government tries to divide the public opinion by categorizing the press between the good journalists and the bad journalists. And of course, the bad journalists are those who criticize and dissent. This section is contrary to the values of democracy, restricting the flow of information and misinforming the society. Furthermore, we continue to highlight through evidence that judicial harassment is on the rise. Last year, on average, 3 journalists or media outlets were sued every month for exercising the right to inform. Within this context, we have also witnessed a collapse of institutions. For instance, while the budget for the Special Victims Commission was reduced by 3%, this is about 25 million pesos, from 2021 to the present year, the approved budget for the National Guard for this year is 62.8 billion pesos. This is an increase of 70% compared to the 2021. This is the position of a government that prefers loyal militaries over critical victims who demand justice and their rights. On the other hand, the federal protection mechanism to protect human rights defenders and journalists, of course, is necessary, but insufficient, as long as the Mexican state continues attacking the press and denying its role and the responsibility that has to protect all the press. In fact, the shortcomings of protection public policies, alongside poor practices in the procurement and administration of justice, contribute to a national impunity rate of almost 99% for this crime. This means that almost no crimes against freedom of expression and against journalists is resolved in Mexico. Violence against the press has led to greater concern at the national and international levels due to the alarming pattern of the murder of journalists and given the recurrent question of what to do. And today I can say, and I'm asking, we need to strengthen prevention and protection policies by providing technical support to improve the capabilities and resources of the prosecution authorities, keep supporting the initiatives to strengthen the protection mechanism, supporting organized civil society-led efforts to increase transparency and accountability in crimes against freedom of expression. And finally, remind Mexican authorities that the US Congress could limit support through the Leahy law limitations under the Section 620M of the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, as to enforce the Mexican authorities to properly investigate cases of torture, enforce disappearances, and other human rights violations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mathiacci.
Hi, thank you very much, Representative McGovern, Representative Smith. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here today about the serious human rights challenges in Mexico and the important role that U.S. policy can play in responding to them. My name is Tyler Mathiacci. I am a researcher from Human Rights Watch in the Americas Division, and I am based in and cover Mexico. I want to start by saying that I agree wholeheartedly with the concerns that my colleagues from Centro Pro, from WOLA, and from Article 19 have raised and will raise during this hearing regarding impunity, regarding militarization, regarding freedom of expression and disappearances. I am going to talk about another issue because I want to make sure that we cover the range of problems that exist in Mexico right now. And it's an issue through which the United States and Mexico are inextricably linked, immigration policy and abuses against migrants and asylum seekers. Mexico is a major country of transit and increasingly a country of destination for migrants and asylum seekers from Central and South America, the Caribbean, and all over the world. Hundreds of thousands of people travel to or through Mexico every year, and many of them are fleeing from violence, persecution, armed conflict, or human rights abuses in their home countries. While they are in Mexico, they often suffer serious human rights abuses and violence at the hands of criminal cartels and common criminals, but also at the hands of Mexican police, soldiers, and immigration agents. These can include kidnapping, extortion, robbery, rape, and even murder. Cartels operating in many parts of Mexico, but especially near the US border, systematically target migrants and asylum seekers. They intercept them at bus stations, hotels, and border crossings. They often kidnap them and demand ransom payments that range from hundreds to thousands of dollars. Mexican immigration agents and police also regularly target migrants and asylum seekers to extort payments from them, threatening to deport them, kill them, or turn them over to cartels if they don't pay. As my fellow panelists have mentioned, impunity is almost absolute in Mexico, and many of the crimes that have been mentioned here are rarely, if ever, reported, investigated, or punished. In fact, authorities are often complicit. In many cases, victims say that Mexican police witness these crimes but do nothing to help. And in others, victims in fact attempt to report crimes, but police refuse to help them or even threaten to turn them over to cartels as retaliation for having attempted to report the crimes. Mexican President López Obrador has greatly expanded immigration enforcement efforts. This includes by deploying nearly 30,000 Mexican soldiers, mostly in northern Mexico, to stop migrants and asylum seekers from reaching the US. This is part of a larger militarization trend that my colleagues have also mentioned in their testimony. López Obrador has reportedly done this at the urging of the Biden administration. In their attempts to stop people from reaching the US, Mexican soldiers and immigration agents have kicked and beaten and even shot and killed migrants and asylum seekers. Mexico is also apprehending record numbers of migrants. Most of them are sent to immigration detention centers. In 2021, Mexico apprehended the highest number ever recorded of migrants. Conditions in Mexican immigration detention centers are truly appalling. Men, women, and children are held together in cramped spaces, sometimes without running water, electricity, or even natural light. They've been denied medical care or access to phone calls. During the pandemic, many were not provided with face masks or even soap. In at least one case, a man died of COVID-19 after staff at a Mexican immigration detention center denied him access to medical care. It's important to know also that in many cases, people who come to Mexico seeking asylum are also sent to these immigration detention centers. We've documented in the past, Human Rights Watch has documented in the past how thousands of migrants and asylum seekers have been subject to illegal express deportations by the Mexican government. They've been driven to remote points in the jungle along the Guatemalan border and abandoned there with no food, no money, no way to get to their home countries, and nowhere to sleep for the night. Many migrants arrive in Mexico fleeing from persecution, generalized violence, or human rights abuses, especially in places like Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and also from other places in Central America like Honduras. A growing number of those people are choosing to seek asylum in Mexico, which is their right under Mexican and international law. They face significant challenges in doing so. We've documented how Mexican immigration agents actively dissuade people from seeking asylum and often try to encourage them to accept voluntary assisted return to their home countries, even when they say that their lives would be at risk if they were sent there. Those who do manage to apply for asylum are thrown into a system that is unable to keep up with the soaring numbers of applicants. Over the past decade, the number of people applying for refugee status in Mexico has increased 174 times to a record high. Last year, over 130,000 people applied for asylum in Mexico. But funding from the Mexican federal government for its refugee agency has increased just 2.5 times during that same period. Last year, the government processed just a quarter of the applications it received, and the agency is truly overwhelmed. Most applicants are forced to wait for months or years in the small city of Tapachula near the Guatemalan border. It's surrounded by military checkpoints and has become a de facto holding center for asylum seekers, where many are unable to find work or housing and face severe discrimination. It's important that when we talk about these abuses against migrants in Mexico, we understand the central role of US policy. For decades, the US has leaned on the Mexican government to reduce the number of migrants arriving at the US southern border. Former President Trump took this policy farther than ever before, threatening crippling tariffs unless Mexico took unprecedented action to crack down on migration, and also implementing policies like Title 42 and Remain in Mexico, which returned hundreds of thousands of people to Mexico and delivered them directly into the hands of cartels that operate in border cities, preying on migrants who are often forced to wait there for years. The Biden administration has taken some steps to reverse some of these policies, but it also continues to engage with the López Obrador government frequently on reducing the number of arrivals at the border. The Biden administration has, in its own words, secured agreements for Mexico to deploy troops for immigration enforcement, and Mexico's Secretary of Defense has said that one of his main goals of the Mexican armed forces is to stop migration. It's important to understand that when migrants and asylum seekers are detained in inhumane conditions in Mexico, when they're beaten in immigration raids by soldiers or immigration agents, when they're abandoned in the jungle, it's partially because of this pressure from the United States. This is compounded by the fact that Title 42 and Remain in Mexico are still in place more than 2 years after Trump created them, which has contributed to the growing backlog of asylum cases in Mexico's refugee agency, as more and more people who have been denied the chance to seek asylum in the US are choosing to do so in Mexico. To begin addressing these abuses, the US should refocus its immigration cooperation with Mexico beyond just the outsourcing of enforcement, which has not been successful at reducing the number of people who reach the border and has also contributed to these serious abuses, and focus more on ensuring that the two countries can work together to ensure that people fleeing from violence are humanely received. The two administrations took an important step towards that earlier this month when they signed the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection at the Summit of the Americas. But to turn the commitments from that document into actions, the administration should do everything it can to end abusive policies like Title 42 and Remain in Mexico, which undermine its credibility on those issues. It should provide more support for Mexico's refugee agency, and it should continue engaging with the Mexican immigration authorities to ensure they respect the right to seek asylum and do not return people to places where their lives are in danger. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Brewer.
Good afternoon, and thank you. My name is Stephanie Brewer. I'm Director for Mexico and Migrant Rights with WOLA, the Washington Office on Latin America. I thank the Commission for convening this important hearing on human rights in Mexico. Mexico faces numerous human rights challenges, which disproportionately impact groups affected by poverty and different forms of discrimination. I will not seek to mention all of these challenges. I will focus my testimony today on some of the most pressing human rights issues related to state and non-state violence, public security policies, and access to justice. As my fellow panelists described, Mexico's human rights crisis includes both violence and abuses committed directly by state agents and the government's failure to provide justice and protection against widespread violence perpetrated by criminal groups. The central human rights problem facing Mexico is the lack of a reliable system to prevent and punish abuses and crimes by state and non-state actors. In this environment, violence is used as a low-cost tool of power by perpetrators who believe, often correctly, that Mexico's institutions will not investigate or prosecute them. Mexico has now reached over 100,000 disappeared people. A 2021 investigation by WOLA found that only a handful of cases result in charges. Data provided by the Mexican government to the UN Committee on Enforced Disappearances in November 2021 indicate that only 2 to 6% of disappearances have led to prosecutions. Impunity is also near absolute for torture. Despite receiving thousands of criminal complaints for torture in recent years, the annual number of cases in which the National Prosecutor's Office brings charges are routinely counted in the single digits. At the state level, of 25 state judiciaries that responded to WOLA's information requests last year, only 1 reported torture convictions in 2020 and none reported convictions in the first half of 2021. Human rights violations occur against the backdrop of record levels of lethal violence in Mexico, with over 36,000 annual homicides from 2018 to 2020. In 2021, 966 murders were classified as femicides by authorities, or murders of women for gender-based motives, with thousands more women murdered. According to the government's National Victimization Survey, only about 10% of crimes against the population are reported. This is due largely to lack of trust and confidence in authorities. Between underreporting, lack of investigation, and lack of prosecution, overall impunity for crimes against the population is roughly 99%. Mexico's federal government's response to crime has been to deploy the military in policing tasks. This strategy increased sharply, with US support, during the presidency of Felipe Calderón beginning in 2006. Militarization was announced as a temporary measure while civilian institutions were reformed. Over 15 years later, annual homicides have more than tripled, disappearances have skyrocketed, and using the military to confront crime while targeting kingpins in criminal structures has led to the fragmentation and evolution of criminal groups. This has led to the diversification of their illicit activities and greater lethal violence as groups reconfigure. Mexico's population has suffered the consequences. Current President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has deepened the military model by replacing the civilian federal police with a National Guard that reports to a civilian ministry on paper, but is operationally controlled by the Ministry of Defense and composed overwhelmingly of military personnel. Military deployment in security tasks is at an all-time high. Hundreds of thousands of Army, Navy, and National Guard troops participate in policing and other domestic tasks, and the armed forces have seen budget increases even amid austerity measures for other institutions. Militarization fails to address Mexico's low rates of effective investigations of crimes and human rights violations. Mexico cannot militarily deploy its way out of this fundamental problem. It is this climate of impunity that perpetuates violence, corruption, and collusion between state and non-state criminal actors. It is thus vital that Mexico build capable, trustworthy, and sufficiently resourced civilian security and justice institutions, especially at the state level. Such institutions require effective control mechanisms, and agents must reliably be held accountable for human rights violations and other crimes. What does this mean for US cooperation with Mexico? US assistance has evolved and must evolve further to address these challenges. The Merida Initiative, the over $3 billion US cooperation framework in place from 2008 to 2021, initially invested heavily in supporting a militarized war on crime strategy, paying for aircraft and equipment. Under the Obama administration, the focus shifted increasingly to strengthening the rule of law. Late last year, the Mexican and US governments replaced the Merida Initiative with the Bicentennial Framework. The new framework pledges a focus on violence reduction and a public health approach to problematic drug use. It is too early to judge the new framework's success, but initial results announced by US and Mexican officials in April focus largely on traditional actions, such as targeted arrests and drug interdiction, showing that continued monitoring will be essential. We recommend that the United States ensure that its cooperation with Mexico focus on improving the work of civilian institutions and the criminal justice system, accountability for corrupt and rights-violating agents, and support for the work, protection, and rights of victims, families, human rights defenders, and journalists who face high levels of risk, as we have heard today. Ongoing focus areas of U.S. human rights assistance that should continue to be prioritized include implementation of Mexico's laws against torture, disappearances, and femicides, forensic identification capacity to help respond to the more than 50,000 unidentified bodies in government custody, and working with Mexican partners to improve the operation of Mexico's young adversarial criminal justice system. We urge Congress to exercise its oversight capabilities to assess the effectiveness of U.S. assistance to Mexico, ensuring that the stark lessons of the Merida Initiative lead to evidence-based improvements within the new Bicentennial Framework that will truly increase the population's safety and access to justice. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cardenas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Smith, for, again, to reaffirm what is extremely timely hearing on the situation in Mexico. It's going to be impossible for me to improve on the presentations of my colleagues in terms of the specific issues of concern in human rights in Mexico and broader counter-narcotics campaign, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought what I best could do is contribute a little bit of an analysis of who exactly is President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, AMLO, because it raises serious questions whether he can be a reliable partner in improving the situation, if that is, the situation can be improved under his watch. As Chairman Smith mentioned at the top of the hearing, AMLO is a man of the left. I would go a little bit further and qualify him as, or characterize him as, an unreconstructed Latin American leftist from the 1970s. And that means something very specific. I'm not here to score cheap political points at his expense. He is what he is. You think Galeano's open veins. That is exactly who AMLO is. That is the Bible. And the Cuban Revolution remains his life's lodestar in all its romantic glory. And the intervening 6 decades he's been impervious to any reconsideration, any reflection, recognition of how the Cuban Revolution ultimately turned out. Before being electing president in 2018, AMLO spent his career on the margins of Mexican politics, occupying what may be called the angry left pole in the country's political spectrum. His worldview is basic, some might say it's facile, dominated by his identification with the common man and woman of Mexico, who he believes, not without justification, are victimized by a system controlled by elites, by them and for them. It's a black and white, us versus them prism through which all issues flow in Mexico. As such, he has a visceral distrust of Mexico's prevailing institutions, political norms, and most other political, economic, and social arrangements, which he sees as inherently biased against the Mexican poor and working poor, which frankly is quite ironic when the latter is the primary victims of the drug violence that is pervasive in the country. And while AMLO's diagnosis may be defensible about what ails Mexican society, his prescriptions are usually narrow, inherently polarizing, and can be characterized as simply doing to elites what he believes had been done to the poor for decades. So what does all of this have to do with human rights and the concerns raised today? Well, I would suggest that that again, it's AMLO has this similarly pinched binary view of us versus them. If he perceives that somebody is on his side, he will be with you. He'll defend you. If he perceives that you are against him, then you likely had it coming because you represent an unfair, in his eyes, discredited system. You're merely a tool of the oligarchs. In effect, AMLO is on a moral crusade to avenge the past sins committed against the poor campesinos, and anyone who questions him is not considered worthy of consideration. And in this dynamic, I just don't think human rights obtains a very, very high priority, or the war against drugs, and I'll talk about that in a second. And when human rights and treating everyone equally and of deserving the same protections by the state, when everybody is not considered that, when it's not a priority, that sort of sentiment pervades the entire government. When people know it's not a priority of the president, then there's going to be a lackluster undertaking of these important initiatives. Now, unfortunately, I do not believe that current U.S. policy is helping matters. My contention is that AMLO has decided that as long as he assists the U.S. in controlling migration at the border and doesn't overly complicate counter-narcotics cooperation between the two countries, then he has earned a free pass in his mind to act as he pleases and ignore broader U.S. concerns. And I don't think that was any more evident than what Chairman Smith mentioned as the recent spectacle surrounding his behavior in the run-up to the Summit of the Americas. His insistence that authoritarian regimes from Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, the worst abusers of human rights in the hemisphere, be invited to the summit, not only succeeded in, frankly, sabotaging that important event, but also set back by decades the cause of democracy and human rights in the Western Hemisphere. Human rights becomes not a good in itself, but to AMLO, human rights becomes an imperialist tool to intervene in domestic situations in the hemisphere. That is where he's coming from. But back to the summit, just as conspicuous was the absence of any strong comment or pushback from the Biden administration towards what AMLO was doing. And as I noted, I suspect they have their reasons, but what is indisputable is that the lack of a robust U.S. response is only going to encourage more provocative and destructive behavior from the Mexican president. Now, there is an opportunity to rectify that situation next month when AMLO travels to Washington for meetings at the White House. I contend that it is imperative that President Biden disabuse AMLO of the notion that he can have it both ways, that he can cooperate on some aspects of our full and comprehensive bilateral relationship, but not on others equally important to both our people's interests. And I think that is a message that is long overdue for AMLO. And I really hope that the administration takes advantage of that trip to set a different course in not only in Mexico, but again, throughout the whole breadth of our hemispheric relations. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Smith, do you want to go first, or I don't know what your time is like. I want to be.
If you'd like, I know we have a vote, but that usually means about 40 minutes.
Yeah, no, I think we're in recess, so but
I just saw the bells go. Great.
yeah, okay, all right.
It's all up to
you. It's up to you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
I'll just ask a few questions. One to Mr. Cardenas. What, the CELAC meeting and this closer collaboration with the Chinese Communist Party, and Jim and I work on the China Commission. I've been chair, he's chair right now. I'm the ranking member. Earlier today, there was a very important hearing on Tibet, and the ongoing repression of Xi Jinping is absolutely appalling, including genocide against the Uyghurs. And yet we see Xi Jinping expanding his influence almost exponentially around the world, including in Latin America and including in Mexico with this organization. And I wonder if you or any of the other witnesses might want to speak to what influence is Xi Jinping having. He's also the source of a great deal of money and the ability for a government that is not doing much on human rights, doing terrible things, frankly, to learn that governance model even more than what they already are doing, following the Cuban model. Secondly, the issue of the immigration detention centers that Mr. Mathiacci mentioned earlier. I wonder if he could just tell us how many are there, what goes on in those places. Are women being abused, for example? And Ms. Ruiz, you had talked about 2 out of 5 attacks against the press can be linked to the Mexican authorities. That's an appalling bit of complicity. If you could maybe elaborate a little bit on that and what we can do to raise those issues. If you want to also provide it for the record, that would be great. The role of the church, the church has always tried to stand in solidarity with the people who are suffering, as the 2 most recent Jesuits would bear witness to, who were murdered. But what are the bishops and the others doing to combat this? I know they have a very difficult road to climb and have historically, but maybe you could speak to that as well. And finally, just on the human trafficking and maybe even drug trafficking, with fentanyl killing so many Americans and others. But I mean, it's so out of proportion, and it's transshipping obviously through Mexico, much of it coming from China. If you wanted to speak to that as well. But, on trafficking, they are a tier 2 country, as you know, according to the U.S. Department of State. The new ratings will come out shortly. But I note that last year it was noted that, the government did not prosecute or convict any public official for complicity in trafficking crimes and took limited action to investigate and prosecute forced labor crimes as well. They did have prosecutions against others, but not the government, people who are complicit. So if perhaps any of our witnesses could speak to that, I would appreciate it. And thank you, Jim.
Mr. Smith, I would address the Cuba issue. I'm sorry, the China issue, if that's okay. I think that the Chinese presence intervention in Latin America is one of the worst developments of the past 20 years in the region, because simply it cannot be explained away as simple economics. Yes, they have a tremendous capacity to bring in investment dollars, infrastructure projects, et cetera, but it doesn't end there. We know that they have an ulterior political motive of operating, but what it means most of all for our partners in Latin America is that China doesn't, unlike the United States, China doesn't have, for example, a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It doesn't approach the region in a holistic manner. Again, this is not the 1970s where rapacious conglomerates and other international corporations run roughshod over the poor victims in Latin America. The United States has a very holistic, where we try to meld our economic engagement with a broader pro-human rights, pro-democracy, pro-civil society policies. China doesn't bring any of that. China will come only with its checkbook and won't ask any difficult questions about conditions inside those countries, usually at questions about government's behavior towards their own citizens. And I think that that is very, very dangerous. And those regimes like AMLO and Maduro in Venezuela, others, they're fine with that. They don't want to be examined, their behavior, government behavior in their own countries. They don't want to have to answer for such indelicate questions, which the United States does. It may be behind closed doors. It may not be via microphone diplomacy, but we do. It's a holistic approach, and the Chinese don't do it. And I think that democracy and respect for human rights in the Western Hemisphere are poorer for it.
Thank you. You didn't mention the CELAC. Do you see that as a threat?
Yes, I do. I don't have a problem with Latin American governments convening on their own to discuss their own interests and regional agendas. But when making common cause with extra hemispheric actors that bring so much concerns and worry, then it's something the United States needs to be deeply concerned about.
Would any of the other witnesses like to speak for the immigration detention centers that was mentioned earlier?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in and talk about that. And I agree, I'll just mention, I agree with Mr. Cardenas about it's concerning, I think, the way that AMLO selectively decides when his foreign policy will be neutral and when it won't, only to defend dictators. In terms of the immigration detention centers, Mexico has one of the largest immigration detention estates in the world. There are 66 immigration detention centers all across the country. In terms of what goes on there, I would say that it's less a case of violent abuses and a more case of neglect, in the sense that because of the quantity of people that Mexico is detaining, they will often sort of turn facilities that were built for something else into an immigration detention center. So there are places where there's an old factory that has been converted into an immigration detention center. And it really means that people are being held in a place that's not meant for large numbers of people to be held. They're overcrowded. You know, I've spoken to many people who said that there's nowhere to sleep except on the floor. There's no, you know, there's not enough food. They ask for things like medical care, and the guards will refuse. The guards won't let them call their families to explain where they are. So it's not necessarily that there are specific, you know, abuses or violence being committed against people, although there have been incidents where there were protests, for example, at immigration detention centers in specific moments, and police or the National Guard were sent in. And we've later heard testimonies that people were beaten or that pepper spray was used or things like that. But I would say that the real problem is neglect. People being kept in places that are not suitable for people to be staying, and not being given access to basic care. And the major issue there again is when we see people who are entering Mexico, who are fleeing from violence and persecution. We see this with people coming from Nicaragua. I've spoken personally to people who arrived in Mexico from Nicaragua. They arrived from Venezuela. They arrived from Cuba. They arrived from Haiti. They arrived from Honduras. But they come with legitimate reasons to want to seek asylum. And when they say that to Mexican immigration officials in the detention centers, the officials will try actively to convince them not to apply for asylum and we'll try to convince them to sign a document agreeing to be returned to their country, which is very worrying and violates basic principles of Mexican and international law.
Thank you.
I'm just gonna jump to talk about the press, and what I was referring to is according to the register that we do at Article 19, the public officials, like authorities, are the major direct perpetrator of attacks against the press. So at least in 2021, out of those 644 attacks that we document around all the year, at least in 270 out of those attacks, at least 274 of those attacks were perpetrated by public officials. So that means the state is the major perpetrator against the press, and of course, stigmatization and polarization, and just the stigmatization discourse against the press is also increasing or helping to increase the violence that other people perpetrate against the press. And that's why after public officials, the ones that perpetrated attacks against the press, the most is just individuals. It's not the organized crime. That's not correct. That's incorrect. That's something that the federal government is trying to bring into the discussion again. It's not the organized crime. And even, of course, the organized crime perpetrates some aggressions, and those has to be investigated, but it's the state who perpetrates the majority of attacks. And of course, it's linked to the impunity against freedom of expression. That is almost 99%, is way higher than the national average on impunity rate. And it's linked to the investigations that the press is doing. And that's why I mentioned it, the coverage of corruption, which is the one that is linked to the majority of the cases.
Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, I can just address the other question. I think, as in any institution, sometimes hierarchy in churches have a lack of empathic approach to the large and widespread violence in the country. But I have to say that examples such as the one that we were talking today, and in many other regions in Mexico, it's actually priests or other religious orders who have the presence in places where the state doesn't even have, like the possibility to act or to be present around. And I think that's why it's very important what Stephanie mentioned around the importance of the state to be able to prevent violence and to have an approach about that, because it's really in many places in Mexico, it is only people very brave like Father Joaquin and Father Javier who are the ones that are doing basically state actions and bringing up actions that would or even bring insecurity by their being there to the communities.
Thank you. Chairman McGovern, I yield back.
Thank you all. Let me just say, kind of at the outset, I kind of I come at this from a very different, from a little bit of a different perspective. I don't think the underlying issue is left or right. I think it really is authoritarianism. These are leaders and governments that embrace militarism. And as we've heard from some of the testimony here today, that's not a new issue in Mexico. That's not just happening with this government. It's happened with governments for years. It's about governments that crack down on freedom of the press because they don't want any dissent, or try to undercut the rule of law. And we see that in governments that supposedly are left, and we see that in governments that are right or in the middle. I mean, all throughout Latin America. We see that in Mexico. Look what's happening in El Salvador right now. We can Nicaragua or Guatemala. And so the value of a human rights perspective is to see whether governments, whatever they claim to be or however we view them, it's a way for us to see whether they are complying with their international human rights obligations. And I think I think so. If we get into this left-right side, I think we kind of missed the point. I spent some time in Colombia, and I think the chairman mentioned the Colombian elections in his opening statement. I was looking at the votes in Colombia, and where Gustavo Petro really won that race were in areas of Colombia that the state wasn't present, where people thought after the peace accords were signed that the government would be present to provide security, to provide protection, to provide services, and they weren't there, and so that's where the big vote came out. I think you can understand the frustration of people, but the problems that we're talking about right now are not particularly new. The other thing I'll say, and this is a frustration I've had with Democratic administrations and Republican administrations with regard to our policy toward Latin America. When we're not talking about left versus right, the only two things we talk about are migration and drugs. And I think in part because that's where most of the discussion and most of the focus tends to be here in Congress. But I think we ought to spend more time having discussions like we're having here today about protecting people's rights, about the rule of law, about the rise in criminal activity, about corruption, about what governments again what their obligations are under international law, and that they're not maintaining them. I know the Biden administration, and I think other administrations, no matter who the president of Mexico was, probably are not pushing as hard on some of these other things because they're focused on migration. And if they pushed on other things and Mexico all of a sudden wasn't so compliant with some of the things that our government claims it wants, then everybody would be screaming, why aren't you working with the Mexican government to do whatever you can to keep migrants from coming across the border? So it's, I just say all this because I do think, that we need to look at, again, not only what the Mexican government is not doing, and again, not just, I think there's systemic issues here. There are structural issues here that date back well before this current government. Mexico's human rights problems, again, predate, for example, the U.S. government's efforts to greatly increase Mexico's involvement in preventing migrants from reaching or entering the United States. But your testimony suggests that migration cooperation is directly worsening the human rights situation in Mexico. Am I understanding that correctly? And if so, could somebody explain to me or identify ways in which this is happening? I open this up to anybody who wants to take the question.
I'm
Yeah.
happy to take that question. I would say, in terms of the rights of migrants, yes. There are a whole range of human rights abuses that we have discussed here today. And migrants and asylum seekers traveling through Mexico have faced all kinds of abuses for a long time. One side of that has always been the issue that I think we're talking about here, which is the lack of capacity of the Mexican government to protect people from criminal actors. And so for decades, migrants have been the targets of criminal groups. The other side of that is I do think that as the policy of leaning on Mexico to stop migration has intensified, and this is, again, as you say, this is not necessarily something new. This is a policy that it goes back to Bill Clinton, right? But it's something that has continued developing over time, and that each subsequent administration has taken up. But asking Mexican security forces to do that task is asking them to do something that they fundamentally are not trained to be doing, which is the same concern that I think many of us have about asking the military to conduct law enforcement tasks. And that's one of the ways that it's leading to increased abuses. I
Anybody
don't know
else?
if anyone else wants to add.
I want to add something, sorry, not necessarily on migration. For instance, what I was saying about how from one year to another, from 2020 to 2021, the attacks against the press that there were covering things related to land and environment triple is completely related to, directly linked to the fact that the government is building, or this has this economic federal strategy of building a lot of mega projects that where the army is already, like, it's also involved. So now all the things related to the Mayan train or other mega projects are now, according to the government, matters of national security. So then the army is involved, and there are a lot of human rights violations against human rights defenders and journalists that are covering that those topics. So it's just like another example of militarizing the country is just creating way more issues and serious human rights violations. But Stephanie, please.
I was just going to add on the impact of US pressure on Mexico to contain or block migration. We see this now even at Mexico's southern border. I was there several months ago, so was Tyler actually. And with the US request to Mexico to put visa restrictions on several South American nationalities, we see, for instance, a dramatic increase in which now thousands and thousands and thousands of Venezuelans are crossing the treacherous Darien Gap that connects South America to Central America to migrate northward by land, fleeing from Venezuela. That's one very clear example of how policies that are designed primarily to try to just block or make the migration path more difficult, what they end up doing is just increasing the suffering and increasing the risk and ultimately injuries, death, and other crimes committed against migrants. But they don't, of course, actually address the driving factors behind forced migration. I also wanted to highlight how these types of policies, when they're not accounting for and prioritizing access to protection, when they're not facilitating access to legal pathways to those who need them and to those who actually qualify for them many times under current law, what they do is increase demand and profits for organized criminal groups. And this is at the southern border, the northern border, and throughout the route. So if we look from the north, of course, we have right now still ongoing expulsions of people under Title 42 without even the chance to request protection. Another civil society counterpart who's not here today, Human Rights First, has tracked over 10,000 reports of attacks, including kidnappings, sexual assault, rape, murder, and extortion, and other types of crimes against migrants and asylum seekers who were directly expelled or blocked by the United States and pushed directly into the hands of criminal groups along the border. But these crimes also occur throughout Mexico, and each step of the migration journey for migrants and asylum seekers means paying somehow, paying bribes to corrupt authorities or facilitating as well these activities, or paying to be let go by criminal groups, being extorted when they're kidnapped. Kidnapping of migrants, by the way, is often a binational crime, and it should be prioritized and addressed by Mexico and the United States in a coordinated manner. So I think that context also, of course, our priority is the safety of those migrants and asylum seekers, their access to protection, their ability to seek asylum, but also stepping out and seeing how some of these policies are fueling organized criminal violence and profits in Mexico.
Let me ask, several years ago, Mexico established a protection program for human rights defenders and journalists, a program that has received support from USAID. Can anybody tell me how well is the protection program working? I mean, how could it be improved? And How can the U.S. best contribute to strengthening the program?
Sure. Like the thing is, it is helping, but it's not, as I was saying at the beginning, the mechanism, it is necessary, and we prefer having it than not having it. That's for sure. But the fact that the authorities think that just one entity is going to resolve everything that causes violence against human rights defenders and the press, it's just never going to be enough. So unless the authorities stop attacking the press directly and preventing the violence through mainly tackling impunity against these cases, because it's very easy to attack the press in Mexico because there are not consequences. And I'm not just talking about investigation, I'm talking about access to justice, damage reparation, and actually like ensuring that there's guarantees of non-repetition. So I feel like the support from USAID has been very helpful, but it could also be translated, for instance, to strengthen the prosecution authorities, because as we all mentioned, there are a lot of lack of capabilities and resources to actually investigate, and they don't coordinate between states. So I think like that's one of the biggest things that we need to work in, strengthening the prosecution authorities and tackling impunity, because otherwise it's just never going to stop. But of course, also strengthening the mechanism by more resources and just coordinating more with other authorities within the country.
Let me ask.
Can I add something?
Sure,
quick?
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with Paula. I think that the main issue is the impunity, but also I think it's important to say that the current government is planning on reforming the law that creates the mechanism to basically give more responsibilities to the local states and basically dissolve a little bit of the responsibility of the federal government. And we totally understand that this is because most of the cases are local. But the problem is that, as we mentioned, collusion and corruption means that permeates to all the federal, all the security forces. So what we will have is also, like the people who might be involved in the attacks to the press or to the human rights defenders will be also involved in creating protection measures. So it doesn't make sense.
I mentioned, go ahead.
Can I also jump in there, Congressman? I'm sorry.
Yes, no, absolutely. Just jump in. This is like Hollywood Squares. I'm trying to follow everybody here. And so just,
I'm sorry, I wasn't sure if I should use the hand raise function or just actually raise my hand here. We've also been following the issue of the protection mechanism and the proposed reform, which is supposed to be announced in the fall. And I agree with the issues that everyone raises here. I mean, I think the central thing is impunity and this idea that the government is focusing just on one solution, right? But there are a number of ways that the mechanism could be stronger and could be better at what it does. And there, I think, is the potential for the reform that they're going to propose to be something that makes the mechanism better and better able to protect people, or not. It depends on the final language of the reform. I think one of the key elements there is how this coordination, because it's run by the federal government, how this coordination with state governments works, and it's something we need to pay attention to, because as Maria Luisa mentioned, if the end result is that they ask state governments to be in charge of protecting people, but those same state governments are the ones that are attacking people, the whole system would not make any sense. But one of the other problems that's easier to solve, I guess, is money, which is that the mechanism needs more of it. It has done a good job in some cases, and as a result, there is a lot of demand for people who are requesting protection, and the number of people who have requested protection from the mechanism has increased a lot. It's tripled in the past I think 3 years, but the funding has not, and the staff has not. And Lopez Obrador has been trying to save money when there should be more money invested into the mechanism. So that's a sort of very concrete, simple thing that can
No,
change.
thank you. Yeah, I just have a couple more questions, and I'll see whether Mr. Smith has any additional questions. I mentioned Javier Trincito, who we met with. He told us that the gun used to kill his son came from the United States and had been used in several other murders. Does anyone have any information that you can share with us on the role of U.S. exports of guns to Mexico as a contributing factor to the human rights violations there?
I don't have the data. I don't know if someone has it, but we have known also in some cases of lethal violence against the press that weapons from the United States are like used in these killings. And I think as you were mentioned, Commissioner, one of the things, the problem in Mexico is systematic. So we need systematic solutions, and we need structural solutions that we might not see tomorrow, the results. And the thing in Mexico and with the organized crime is like, they are not only now in the drug sector, it's human trafficking, it's agriculture, is water, is avocado, is everything. They're everywhere. And I think the idea is like how we tackle this. I feel like it's more about strengthening technical, academic research on like macro criminal networks to actually be able to tackle this systematic problem, including where the weapons are coming from. But I don't know if Stephanie or Tyler or Maria Luisa wants to share something.
Sure, I absolutely echo this need for a systemic focus on the Mexican side, especially, but on the concrete topic of the flow of U.S. sourced arms into Mexico. Pretty consistently throughout recent years, about 7 out of 10 of firearms that are recovered in Mexico and sent for tracing are found to be U.S. sourced. They enter Mexico largely directly being sold to criminal actors crossing the border, so we can speak of actual illegal arms trafficking. It's also important not to focus exclusively on that illegal trafficking, and also to remember that there are illicit arms sales to Mexican security forces, which go through the army, and then a percentage of those weapons ends up being reported as lost and can find their way into the hands either of private criminal actors or, of course, may be used by members of security forces also for the commission of crimes and human rights violations. In the new Bicentennial Framework, this issue was really the priority issue, I think we could say, for the Mexican government in negotiating and now in the implementation phase of the Bicentennial Framework. And there have been some preliminary results announced in that a greater number of Mexican institutions and authorities have been given access and are able to be using e-trace to improve, at least incrementally improve, the tracing of where the weapons are coming from. Of course, we can't ignore that this is a bilateral issue and a foreign policy issue, but also an area where U.S. domestic policy and the legal framework has a very clear impact on the flow of guns into Mexico, with easy availability and purchasing of firearms on this side of the border, of course, being a major contributing factor to the ease with which they are being trafficked and used to commit violent crimes.
No, I appreciate. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I totally agree with
Yeah.
what Stephanie mentioned. I just wanted to point out that actually at Centro Pro we had the opportunity to accompany Javier and Maria Tránsito in some of their actions to demand justice in Mexico. And I think related to your last question, they are some of the people who had been actually been protected by the mechanism. They had to flee their house after the killing of Javier. But I think that's actually one of the main laws or restrictions about the mechanism, because then you can support one person or one family, but the relationship in the state, like the risks that most of the searchers of disappeared in Guanajuato, but in other places as well, remains the same if you don't approach also the justice part, as Paula was saying.
So, I mean, there was some specific things that we can do that will, might help around the edges. We all acknowledge that there needs to be systemic change in Mexico. So maybe I just go quickly, just to everybody. This is my final question: is basically, what are one of the what is one or two of the most important things that we in Congress could do to increase the effectiveness of U.S. efforts to contribute to improving human rights situation, such human rights conditions in Mexico? Ms. Aguirre, we'll start with you, but I just think it would be helpful for the record if you could explain to the audience who are not familiar with Centro Prod, tell us just what the center is and about its work, and where in Mexico do you work? And then if you could answer my question, we'll just go right down the list, and then I'll see if Mr. Smith has anything else. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. We are a human rights organization based in Mexico City. We have been working here for 30 years in Mexico, but we work in different parts of the country. As I mentioned, for example, we represent in some of the aspects of their demands for justice to Javier and Maria Tránsito. We also work with some victims collectives of people who are looking for their loved ones that are disappeared in the country. We had actually we also represent the families of the 43 students that were disappeared in Guerrero, as you mentioned in the beginning of your opening. And we work mainly in cases related of gross human rights violations, such as disappearances, torture, and executions. I think the work that cooperation has been doing in Mexico in terms of strengthening capacities of institutions that are very key in terms of, for example, the mechanism for forensic identification, the extraordinary mechanism, the creation of data for forensic identification in Mexico, or pushing forward to create some or implement the laws on disappearances and torture is very important. I think that, to be honest, has to be done with also with the cooperation with the civil society in Mexico in terms of human rights issues. Most of the steps that have been happening in the last 10 years, like the creation of these frameworks, these normative frameworks, or the pushing forward for changes in terms of the Attorney General's office, or some other changes, have only happened when the victims and the human rights organizations or civil society in general has been involved. And I think, apart from technical cooperation that we really think that it's key in terms, for example, of identifications of unidentified bodies, it's key, and I think it's very important, but it also has to come with cooperation with civil society.
Thank you. Mr. Cardenas?
Thank you, Chairman McGovern. I think it's unfortunate that I believe that that President AMLO believes that he has the cards related to the border, related to counter-narcotic cooperation. He, what was it, a few months ago, he forced the U.S. to back off when we arrested a corrupt official in the United States. And lastly, on energy, the United States is desperate on the global scale to replace Russian oil in the international markets, and that's one thing that Mexico has, albeit with a lot of difficulties. But the problem is that Duro. AMLO believes that he, in his mind, he's got the leverage over us, rather than us using leverage against him. And I think that that's what I hope that the president uses that meeting to quietly communicate to him that this has to be a more even relationship. And I think where Congress comes in, Mr. McGovern, is perhaps looking for ways that will get AMLO's attention on issues that matter to him, such as USMCA. I don't know to the extent of what availabilities are within the mechanisms of USMCA to bring issues forward. Of course, we all know that there's labor provisions in USMCA, but whether there's democracy issues, we have to identify areas that create discomfort for AMLO inside Mexico amongst the constellation of forces that are either ambivalent for him, against him, and somehow crimp his domestic standing without a lot of fanfare, without microphone diplomacy, but at the same time communicating U.S. seriousness of purpose in these issues that we're talking about today.
Thank you, Ms. Brewer.
Yes. So I'll mention a few substantive areas and then mention a couple of ways that Congress in particular could be active on these issues. I, of course, endorse some of the areas that have already been mentioned on forensic assistance, also on supporting human rights defenders and victims and family collectives who are themselves human rights defenders, because I wholeheartedly agree with what Maria Luisa says. The change and the progress that we've seen come from those actors. I also wanted to highlight that when we speak about impunity and when we speak about crimes or human rights violations in Mexico, 9 out of 10 times we're speaking about crimes that will be within state jurisdiction, not federal jurisdiction. And so it's important to keep that focus when talking about the need to strengthen both resources, capacity, but accountability as well, and technical assistance and investigative techniques. That needs to be happening not just at the federal level, but also very much at the state level. And the gap that we see right now is not due to a lack of good laws in Mexico most of the time. There are some problems there, but the problem is the gap between the laws on the books or the Constitution, which enshrines human rights, and reality. So quickly, the example of disappearances, the investigation that I mentioned shows that the number of investigations open for disappearances is vastly below the number of people who are reported and recognized by the government itself as disappeared. When those investigations are opened, many times prosecutors' offices don't even have installed the tools that are legally mandated by the law against disappearances, the databases needed to be able to map out this context of macro crime or of organized criminality, patterns, context analysis. Those databases often are not operating. This is the case of the National Forensic Database. So there are these very specific techniques and tools that still need to be put in place for Mexico to be complying with its own laws. Now, in terms of Congress, certainly keeping in and monitoring the reporting requirements that are in current appropriations legislation, ensuring that the administration is providing the information required in those reporting requirements, as well as other information, concrete indicators of success, and making sure that those indicators don't fall into the same problems and deficiencies detected, for instance, by the Government Accountability Office with the Merida Initiative, ensuring that the indicator is not the amount of drugs interdicted, but rather actual measurable indicators of reduction of violence, and supporting Mexico's still young adversarial criminal justice system. The United States has very much provided assistance and supported the installation of that system over a period of many years. It's now enforced in the entire country as of 2016, but police especially, and prosecutors' offices, other institutions still need to bring their performance and their capabilities up to the standard of that system and carry out effective investigations. So that needs to be a major focus of U.S. assistance as well.
Thank you. Mr. Mathiacci.
Thank you. I think that the point that Jose Cardenas makes is fair about this idea that there's a perception that as long as AMLO has leverage around immigration issues, he doesn't need to respond in terms of any other issues. I think that's something that can change if the administration is willing to change the way it approaches immigration issues with Mexico. But I also think that a big part of it is what Stephanie mentioned, which is that a lot of the concrete human rights issues that we're talking about are things that can be changed by engaging either on a state level or engaging with specific institutions within the Mexican government, such as things like the protection mechanism for human rights defenders and journalists, the refugee agency, the search commission for disappeared people, where there are specific points of engagement and ways to support that don't need to involve big decisions from the federal government.
Thank you. And finally, Ms. Salcedo.
Thank you, Commissioner. I will just add two things about what the Congress can do. And one of the things is last year, I remember in December, the U.S. Congress sanctioned the former governor of Puebla, Mario Marin, because it recognized that he is one of the responsibles of the torture and arbitrary detention of one journalist in Mexico, Lidia Cacho. And that sanction was under the section 7031C. And I think like strengthening these international mechanisms, that it's symbolic for the victim is very important, because even if it's not Mexico, they also recognize the violations, but they are not doing anything. But the fact that another government is recognizing this and doing something about it is very important for the victim and for tackling impunity. So I think strengthening those mechanisms of international sanctions is very important. It's something that the U.S. Congress can do. And the other thing is just, as Stephanie was saying, that we have a lot of laws and we have a lot of protocols. We even have this standardized protocol to investigate crime against freedom of expression that it was enacted in 2018, and it was created between the government alongside a lot of NGOs, but just a lot of judiciary institutions from the three levels, federal, local, like state and local, they don't know how to implement this protocol. There are a lot of lack of knowledge on intersectional approach and gender approach to document, investigate, and accompany victims. So it's just very specific things to strengthen and improve the capabilities and resources of the people that are within the institutions.
Well, thank you. And let me yield to Co-Chair Smith to see whether he has any questions or comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very briefly, human sex and labor trafficking, has it gotten worse during this immigration crisis, and including for indigenous Mexicans, particularly women and children, who the cartels and others could be putting into this modern day slavery? When a news media when a journalist is being threatened, since the state has been unable, it would appear, to properly protect when those threats are coming in before they disappear or are murdered, what do the news media outlets do to protect their own people? Do they have enhanced security? Do they hire the best of the best to protect their journalists? And finally, Ms. Aguilar, you had mentioned that 95% of the homicides are unresolved. In the United States, according to the FBI, we're about 61% resolved. The remainder unresolved any given year. Thereabouts, about a third go unresolved. And I'm just wondering if, you had put some of the blame on the prosecutors? Is it lack of capability and resources and investigative tools? Or are they, prosecutorial discretion being what it is, are they talked out of it out of fear for their own lives?
Well, I'm going to start with the first question about the media outlets. It's like some media outlets, they do have a lot of security measures. Some, for instance, they have decided to stop signing or asking the reporters to stop signing some publications just for security
No
matters.
byline.
Yeah. And another thing that is very, very bad and sad, and I think has a lot of negative impacts for the access to information for Mexican society, is like there are so many news that there aren't just stopped being reported because there are places like Zacatecas, Tamaulipas, Michoacán, Guerrero, and I can keep going, where journalists are just not able to keep covering some things exactly because it's between life and death. But one of the things is like journalists have increased their capabilities for self-protection and networks between them and other NGOs. So that's it's something that it's very important to keep supporting, like how we help journalists to keep having and strengthening their security protocols within media outlets, but also independent journalists.
If I could just on very similar, those who are disappeared, it's 29 who are disappeared 2020, 2020,
29, yeah.
29. In the past, how many of those disappeared have been recovered? And not many.
No, like those 29, it's just 100% impunity. We don't know anything about, we don't even know that they're actually like investigating those disappearing. It's just like 100% of impunity in the cases of disappearing of journalists.
Chairman Smith, if I
Yes,
may,
please.
you've mentioned the issues of human trafficking and forced labor. There's a recent episode that I think bears mentioning because it reveals the temperament of the individual we're dealing with in President Lopez Obrador. Is that during all of this controversy over the summit and AMLO's attempt to include authoritarian regimes from the hemisphere, one of the number of colleagues, your colleagues in the House and the Senate, have raised issues about AMLO's use of Cuban medical personnel within Mexico that, any way you look at it, constitute chapter and verse violations of international labor standards. And several members have made public this issue with AMLO. AMLO, in just as he was entertaining the authoritarians in Havana and Caracas and Nicaragua, he ostentatiously said that we're going to bring in 500 more. And so again, it speaks to this idea of not as human rights as values in themselves, but simply as political footballs to toss them back and forth with anybody he thinks is not on his side. So again, Cuban doctors that should be paid directly and not through the government to Havana, again, I think gives us an idea of really how important the concept is to him. It's not. And so I just wanted to put that in there because I know that you care deeply about those forced labor, human trafficking issues.
Thank you.
Could I just quickly also add on the subject of trafficking? The most recent civil society report that I saw, which breaks down Mexico by different regions, found comparing now to a few years ago, in some regions, the geographic reach and routes of trafficking seemed to be more or less the same. In some regions, there was some expansion. There is certainly a link to be made between migration policies and the vulnerability of people, especially, of course, migrants, to trafficking, in the sense that if people are forced into the shadows, they don't have legal means to seek protection or to migrate, or they're forced into contact with criminal groups or smugglers. Those are all factors that increase their vulnerability to trafficking. So that's an important link, but it's also crucial to understand that the evolution of criminal groups in terms of diversification of their activities and their power and control on different markets or routes or regions is an underlying factor that is operating in trafficking, and it's operating with, of course, collusion by different state agents. And so this is the reason that, for instance, a military deployment in Mexico is not going to address or prevent or put an end to these issues, because the problem is within institutions themselves. It's in the relationship between state agents and non-state violent actors or exploitative actors. And that is why we need to focus on creating institutions and environments in which, first, victims, especially the very vulnerable victims, as is the case here, are able to make a complaint, are able to follow through with their cases. They have protection, and also that the state actors respond correctly to investigate those cases. So I would just bring it back as well to that larger context, but certainly aggravated by migration policies as well.
You know, on that point, and I thank you for raising it, I'm the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, prime author. And when we did the reauthorization, we included militaries for analysis as to what the tier rating would be. So you raise a very good point with the military being deployed so, you know, aggressively throughout Mexico. What is that military doing to be complicit in human trafficking? And I think it was a very good point you raised. Thank you. Because that can result in a different tier rating for them if they are indeed part of the problem, not the solution. Thank you.
And maybe just to address your question, Mr. Chairman, the problem with impunity, I mean, I would say like in most crimes, but homicides in particular, because that's kind of the crime that it's easier to track, because you don't need people to denounce it. They're investigated, and those are the most trustable records. Is that most of them rely on local prosecutors' offices. So the local prosecutors' offices have to investigate most of these homicides, even though many of them are related to organized crime, which will lie into the competence of the federal prosecutor's office, which usually denies most of the cases, or will not attract most of the cases. So, for example, the case of the priests, or the case that Representative McGovern was talking about Javier, most of those cases are in hands of the local prosecutors. And then we have obviously very different capacities in the 32 states. But in general, the main problem is all of them, what you mentioned, basically. So lack of capacities, that's true. But also the prosecutors' offices are also some of the institutions that are more corrupted and collude with criminals in the region. So basically, it's part of also lack of political will. I mean, even if they would have the capacities, they would not investigate. And the reality is also that they are overwhelmed. I mean, like there are very few resources, human resources in those offices. So it's a problem of a lot of things together. But in many cases, it's also the issue of corruption and collusion. I mean, people like those are institutions in some regions in Mexico that would just not be interested in investigate those crimes.
Thank you. I too want to join you, Mr. Chairman, in thanking our very distinguished witnesses for their incisive commentary, the insights that they help us to better understand what's going on and help to show us a way forward. I yield back, and again, thank you.
Yeah, well, I want to thank everybody here. We've talked a lot about migration here, and again, I go back to what I said at the very beginning. I mean, I think one of the ways to alleviate the migration problem or challenge at our border is to make sure that we, are pursuing policies that are not creating conditions, that sometimes result in migration. I mean, I said, one of my frustrations with Democratic and Republican administrations for years is that I think our policy toward Latin America in general has been, almost just about two things, and really not addressing some of the underlying problems of not just of poverty, but of corruption, of human rights abuses, of militarism, and you know, and you know, and I still don't think we get it. And even it, we do want more investment, and we want more. We want to see the economies in Latin America grow, but that's part of it, right? The other part, I mean, we have to deal with issues like hunger. We have to deal with the issue of climate change, where people cannot utilize their land anymore, and we have to address some of these other systemic issues of militarism, corruption, impunity, all that stuff. And I thought one of the missed opportunities after all the wars that we were somehow involved with in Central America during the 1980s is that when some of these hostilities came to an end, we weren't there with the economic support, not just us, but the international community, to help these countries rebuild. And anyway, that's just a side rant on what otherwise we hear is a very, very important conversation. And we hope that we can continue to stay in touch with you about ideas we may have, but we also welcome, at any time, any suggestions you have on how we might be able to be of assistance in promoting a human rights agenda in Mexico that, that quite frankly, the people of Mexico desperately deserve. So I appreciate it very much. Thank you very much. Co-Chair Smith, thank you. Everybody be safe. The hearing is adjourned.